From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Biden warns Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu that U.S. support hinges on protecting civilians in Gaza. We'll have details from their meeting today and discuss future U.S. policy with Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group.
We'll also hear his insights on Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's second trip to China in 9 months, with potential trade restrictions on the agenda.
And as Congress returns to work next week, lawmakers face a host of challenges, including Ukraine funding and a threat to the speakership. We'll hear from Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan, and we'll talk with Libby Cantrill of Pimco. A lot to cover this hour. Kaylee, of course, it's not just Ukraine funding that lawmakers will be dealing with. It's support for Israel, I guess monetary support, I should say, as well as military support, which becomes a big question now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that conversation could very much change depending, if the White House is to believe, on the actions of Israel over the coming days and weeks, because that is what President Biden expressed to Prime Minister Netanyahu on a call earlier today. And we got more detail from NSC spokesman John Kirby this afternoon when he was briefing the press. Just take a listen to what he said.
In the call today, the Prime Minister reiterated his thanks to President Biden and this administration for the support that we have continued to provide Israel. It's long-standing. It was before the 7th of October, and it is now. And that support's going to continue. But again, with respect to Gaza, we need to see certain changes. And if we don't, then we'll have to consider changes to our own policy.
Changes to our own policy. Interesting, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivers as well a strongly worded message, speaking during a meeting with NATO ministers in Brussels. Here he is.
Despite important steps that Israel has taken to allow assistance into Gaza, the results on the ground are woefully insufficient and unacceptable. Right now, there is no higher priority in Gaza than protecting civilians, surging humanitarian assistance, and ensuring the security of those who provide it. Israel must meet this moment.
Joining us now is Bloomberg White House reporter Akayla Gardner. Akayla, tough talk today. This is clearly an important moment. Will it lead to a different U.S. policy?
I think this is the closest thing that we've seen so far from the U.S. when it comes to conditioning, if you will, even though they're not exactly using those words. But they want to see changes from Israel. They want to see a reduction in civilian harm. They want to see an environment where humanitarian workers are be able to work safely. And this was really catalyst from the deaths of those 7 workers from that World Central Kitchen organization. And that is something that the White House admitted openly today. This is definitely the strongest language I've heard from John Kirby. He admitted that has been a frustration with Israel. So there's certainly a shift in policy, and that really was the catalyst of those tragic deaths we saw earlier this week.
Well, and of course, it was just one day after those deaths, Tuesday, when there was a primary in multiple states in which either uncommitted or uninstructed, depending on what state we're talking about, had a sizable protest vote, not voting for Biden because of these policies. And certainly those political pressures factor into this as well.
Yeah, I mean, in Wisconsin, we saw almost 50,000 voters vote for that uninstructed vote. And we have seen similar votes in Michigan and Minnesota. It's been fascinating just because foreign policy is not an issue that typically plays well in electoral politics, but it's become so central for Biden with progressives, for Arab Americans, for Muslim Americans, for young voters, just key blocks of his coalition that he really needs if he wants to win come November.
Well, and we're thinking as well about progressives on Capitol Hill when it comes to the funding debate over Israel, and we can talk about Ukraine separately. There is a call for conditions, and we're hearing this now from some of Joe Biden's closest allies, like Chris Coons. Are we about to rewrite our policy toward Israel when it comes to strings attached to these weapons?
It was interesting today because John Kirby was asked about weapons that are being sent to Israel. And he said these weapons packages have been authorized months, if not years ago. So he says these are not specifically tied to the war in Gaza. But yet you still have progressives saying that they want those halted. That is not something that the White House seems to be ready to do yet. But this language could be the beginning of some of those calls that we're seeing on Capitol Hill to happen.
Well, President Biden certainly has been busy on the phones with other world leaders this week, not just speaking by phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but of course earlier this week he spoke by phone with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is in China right now. Are we about to get more visibility into just what exactly the U.S. policy toward China is right now as they're trying to warm up relations while also keep in mind national security and economic competition? Or is this just going to be more of us hearing the same concerns and not much tangible being produced?
I think Yellen being there is definitely them trying to show that they have more communication with China. That has been sort of the baseline that they have wanted for a very long time. But in this election year, they have real concerns. The U.S. has said that they have seen activity from China in terms of election interference online. So that's something that we're certainly being able to see. And also concerns about AI, how China could potentially use it. They believe that there's some middle ground there for them to develop some sort of safeguards on AI, but still a hugely intense relationship. And they're trying to find ways to collaborate here.
Yeah, and certainly they don't want China to have some of the technology that powers AI, like advanced semiconductors. And we've seen plenty of action from the administration on that. Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Meantime, Congress will be back next week, and lawmakers are getting ready to grapple with Ukraine aid and potentially a threat to House Speaker Mike Johnson when they return. For more, let's bring in Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government. So, Jack, we've gotten a lot of murmurs around what Ukraine aid potentially could look like when they return from recess. A loan, seizing frozen Russian assets to help pay for it, maybe undoing the LNG export ban as a result. But what is the likelihood that this actually happens in the near term, considering we haven't actually seen any text of anything yet?
Yeah, we haven't seen recent text. We saw the president's initial proposal a number of months ago, and then a huge back and forth. There was pushback from the White House on the LNG proposal, so that doesn't seem to have momentum. The fact that, broadly speaking, the conversation seems to be about how they would structure it and if it's a forgivable loan or what else would be attached to Ukraine aid does seem to show some momentum for some form of Ukraine aid. A couple months ago, it seemed more viable that the conservatives would block aid to Ukraine entirely. So there does seem to be quite a bit of interest in doing something. But as you mentioned, there are so many questions about how they would change the language from the original proposal, what things would be attached to it. There are a ton of variables right now regarding loans, the LNG discussion, and seized Russian oligarchs' assets.
Enter Marjorie Taylor Greene. Of course, she says she will trigger this motion to vacate, which she's filed, but will actually make active on the floor if a Ukraine bill comes to the floor. Based on some of the rhetoric we've heard from her over this recess, she still feels that way. And she's been making fun of him on social media, calling him weak. Is that about to happen next week as well?
She seems serious about it. It's worth keeping in mind that she is kind of using this as leverage in the discussion about Ukraine aid. So is there a deal to strike between leadership and Marjorie Taylor Greene? Unclear, but that's possible. She is very enthusiastic about it. She does not have all the Republicans on board with this. There have been some negative comments about her stance by Matt Gaetz. There for a long time now has been at least quiet interest from moderate Democrats who might help out Republican leadership, and you can help them by not casting a vote rather than voting for them, lowering the threshold that they need to remain speaker. So this seems less like a serious threat than what took Kevin McCarthy out of the speakership, but she certainly could force a vote.
Well, and I wonder if that is all the more reason for Mike Johnson potentially to delay a vote further until he can sort that out in terms of the threat that she may pose, even if it is just her. We haven't really heard any other Republicans come out and say, yes, I would support her effort. I would vote to vacate the chair.
It is just her, but it's worth keeping in mind that this is somewhat of a complicating factor as they move forward on some sort of Ukraine aid, because while she's the one pushing the motion to vacate, there are plenty of conservatives who are very vocal about not wanting to pass Ukraine aid, or the interest in the forgivable loan situation, which has kind of worked its way from a Trump idea to the mainstream. So it's one more complicating factor, one more of many hurdles for Mike Johnson to clear politically to make this politically viable and actually pass something.
Next week's going to be fun. I hope you have a chance to rest up yourself.
Buckle your seatbelt.
This recess. It's the homework period as well for Jack Fitzpatrick. Thank you, sir. From Bloomberg Government, helping us get started on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll continue our conversation on the fate of Ukraine aid and the situation in Congress with Libby Cantrill, head of public policy at Pimco. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If the money that the U.S. were to give, including military assistance, were loans, it would take a lot longer to get that assistance to Ukraine. So that's one thing I'm worried about. And then I think the one other option, the best option, is if Speaker Johnson puts the Senate bill that passed already on the floor and we have a vote on it. That is the cleanest, fastest option to get Ukraine the weapons that it needs as soon as possible.
Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council talking with us around this time yesterday about options for aid to Ukraine in Congress. Lawmakers are back next week. This will be among the first orders of business as we now bring in Libby Cantrill, Managing Director, Head of Public Policy at Pimco. Libby, I'm sure you're excited for all this to get back together next week. Thanks for joining us. I'm curious, now that we've gotten through the shutdowns and we're funded through the rest of the year, what is Wall Street concerned with right now? What are you hearing about from clients? Is there, in fact, concern about global risk around Ukraine? Or did we get through the hard stuff already?
Yeah, I would say, and nice to be with you all. I mean, I would say that for certain clients, Ukraine funding, what's happening in the Middle East, are certainly continue to be a focus. The majority, however, of our clients really have pivoted to the 2024 election, and particularly the horse race between former President Trump and President Biden. Also, actually, some more interest in down ballot races, just given how crucial the composition of Congress will be to many of the fiscal items that will be on the table come 2025, and has a lot of concern or attention from markets and from Wall Street. So I would say, Joe, they're not. I mean, now that we've averted the shutdown, now that we've raised the debt ceiling, of course, almost a year ago, folks are more focused on the election. One thing I will just say, though, because we've got a lot of clients actually asking about what has happened to the bipartisan tax bill that passed on a massive bipartisan basis in the House, but looks to be sort of slowly dying on the vine in the Senate.
Well, yeah, and Bloomberg actually has a great story that we just put out this afternoon on the idea that it looks like Senate Republicans are, in fact, going to kill that $78 billion bill. And it kind of brings us back to the question Joe asked in a different way, the idea that the spending is done. So what else tangible are we likely to get out of this Congress 7 months out from an election when everyone's focused on the campaign?
Yeah, Kayleigh, actually, if you look at just market returns in an election year, usually in terms of the risk assets of the S&P 500, usually that performs pretty well when an incumbent president is up for re-election. Is this correlation or causation? I think that's an open question. But I think part of this sort of thesis that markets do well in an election year is because politicians typically like to stimulate in an election year. They usually like to pass some sort of fiscal stimulus. And I think that was why there was so much focus on that tax bill, because even as you talk about it, it was $80 billion or what have you, but a lot of the effects were actually going to be front loaded. So it was about $100 billion estimated impact from a fiscal perspective in 2024, should that have passed. Now, as you mentioned, it looks like that won't pass, that the Senate just can't sort of come to sort of unanimity regarding some of the provisions and what have you. And I do think the sort of lingering question among Republicans is, why would they want to help President Biden in an election cycle? That's been sort of our view for a while, that odds were actually lower than what people thought, just because of that that sort of political truism that the opposing party doesn't want to help the president seeking re-election. So I think bottom line, though, here is that now that we have spending in the rearview mirror, probably no new fiscal stimulus coming on board in 2024. And as a result, I think many investors are just already pivoting to 2025.
Well, with that in mind, it's already campaign season. We talked to Congresswoman Susan DelBene, who chairs the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. This is her job, to get Democrats elected to the House. She talked to us on the program yesterday specifically about some of the swing districts she's focused on. Here's what she said.
I've been all across the country to swing districts all across the country. And, you talk to folks and these are purple districts. These are places where you have independents. probably folks who are former Republicans who don't know what happened to their party, and others who want to see folks who are going to go to Washington, D.C. to govern, who are going to find solutions to the issues facing our country and help move us forward.
Libby Cantrill, let's look into your crystal ball, because I had a peek at your note to clients that made reference to these races and the balance of power in the House and Senate come November. I think you see the Senate flipping. How about the House?
Yeah, we do see that the odds are pretty high that the Senate flips, Joe, just because, as you know, the Senate map, if you will, is pretty bad for Democrats, defending 23 of the 34 open seats. And of those 23, many are in either red or very purplish states. So it looks difficult for them, not impossible for sure, but looks difficult for them to hold on to the Senate. The House, though, is a different ball of wax. Of course, it's more of a national election. All 435 members of the House are going to be up for re-election. And as we all know, as you've been talking about, sort of ad nauseum, I think at this point, is that there's a very narrow majority that Republicans have. So going into the election with just a very slim majority, meaning that Democrats actually do have a shot. I mean, there are, I think, I would say some tailwinds for Democrats. There's some headwinds for them as well. One tailwind has been the strong fundraising that we've seen out of some of sort of the Democratic groups in terms of the House. Redistricting, a bit of a wash, but maybe benefits Democrats just a little bit. But I think, that the bottom line here, Joe, what we're telling clients is that kind of regardless of which party controls which chamber, neither party is going to have a commanding majority. And that really, as you know, makes a big difference in terms of being able to get really big partisan pieces of legislation through the House and the Senate. So we're guiding clients that we actually might just see whatever composition of Congress come 2025, they may just address the Trump tax cuts, and that's it, just because they don't really have really effective governing majorities. But again, still a lot can change. It's only April, only seven months until the election. So don't want to be too high conviction on any of these calls, but that's sort of the state of play at this point.
Well, when we think about these down ballot races, and this is a question we've been asking a lot, Libby, is we know that the presidential contest may really come down to turnout, to voters being mobilized and willing to go cast a ballot for these two highly unpopular candidates. But if they don't turn out, that affects everyone else on that ballot as well. How do you think about that dynamic? And could it actually be some of these congressional races that drive turnout more so than the presidential race?
It's a great question. It's a great point. I think it's, not only could it be some of these down ballot races, it could also just be some of these other issues that may be in the on the ballot. As we all know, that the presidential election will likely be close again if past this prologue, and just given kind of where polling is right now, it will probably come down to the same 6 swing states that it came down to in 2020. And as a result, sort of the down ballot races in those particular states, as you said, could drive turnout. But also, if there are other issues on those ballots, particularly in Nevada and Arizona, where there will be sort of a de facto abortion rights ballot on issue on the ballot. And we do think that could actually help to drive, turnout both ways, honestly. I think this is the hard thing in terms of prognosticating. As you guys know, it's difficult to know sort of which way these issues may drive turnout and who it will actually, who it will help. Usually low turnout helps Republicans, at least in the past. But, the last few elections have sort of changed that dynamic for sure.
All right, Libby Cantrill from Pimco, always great to have you here on Balance of Power. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up still, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has arrived in China. And we spoke to the former ambassador to China, Gary Locke, about it.
This trip by Secretary Yellen is very important in continuing the progress and the momentum of talks between President Biden and President Xi many months ago. We're seeing a thaw in the relationship, and it's critical.
We have agreed that it's important to both of us, that we don't want to decouple our economies. We want to continue, and we think we both benefit from trade and investment, but that it needs to be in a level playing field. We went for too long with too little communication, and misunderstandings developed.
That was Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking with reporters in Alaska on her way to China, where she has now arrived. Joining us now for more on her trip is Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian, always great to have you here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is the second time Yellen will have gone to China in a 9-month period, always bringing concerns around economic competition and national security. Now we understand she's going to be explicitly expressing concern around China's industrial overcapacity. Is anything, though, realistically going to change as a result of her visit?
You're probably going to see more moves from the United States on pushing to restrict some of that. Some of that can be, moderate tariffs. Some of that can be export controls. But I mean, this is telegraphing to the Chinese that the Americans don't want surprises. In other words, they don't want the Chinese finding out that the U.S. is taking an initiative against them on CNN. And that's important. The reality is, this is not going to be the easiest of trips. But 6 months ago, they weren't taking trips at all. And what we've had is a flurry of high-level meetings from Commerce, from Gina Raimondo. We've had the Secretary of Treasury now going twice. Jake Sullivan has spent literally days with his counterpart in countries all over the world. And of course, Biden just had a phone call for a couple of hours with Xi Jinping this week. Those are all important to help stabilize what is a pretty confrontational relationship.
What role is Janet Yellen playing in the cast of characters here in this administration? Because this will be followed, Ian, by a trip by Antony Blinken. Is this the good cop role that she's playing right now? How would you describe it?
It's on this issue, there's not a lot of good cop, bad cop. I think everyone is on the same page. That's not true in a lot of other areas of policy, but here it is. Nobody wants the United States to get into a big sudden fight with China. Everyone recognizes the Chinese can be very challenging to deal with. The U.S. doesn't want to give away the store, but also that they're trying to have pretty consistent engagement. They don't want confrontation that isn't necessary confrontation. So the only place they want to hit them is areas where the U.S. believes that its national interests are truly at stake. And of course, there are areas for more cooperation in the context of all of that. Fentanyl, you've seen climate coordination, you've seen a bunch of others. But it's not like they're really bad cop and good cop. I mean, like if Blinken is talking to his counterpart, or Jake is, or Janet are, it's not like the Chinese are not, and I've spoken with a lot of high-level Chinese officials in the past weeks, it's not like they're saying, oh, we really like it when policymaker X come to Beijing, but we don't like that one. That's not the case here. Yeah.
Well, obviously, Ian, the U.S. faces great difficulty in navigating the relationship with what is an adversary, but we are seeing the U.S. now having difficulty navigating a relationship with an ally, namely Israel. We know that President Biden spoke with Benjamin Netanyahu today, warning about that U.S. policy around Gaza could change if the administration doesn't see changes it would like to see from Israel in regard to protecting civilians and humanitarian aid. The question, though, is what realistically can change about U.S. policy. And we posed that question to Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council yesterday. Just listen, Ian, if you will, to what he told us.
The U.S. leverage when it comes to Israel is big ticket items that have fundamentally underpinned the U.S.-Israel relationship for years now. So it is major defense hardware like the F-15s that we're talking about being sold, major bombs, intelligence sharing. It's not going 0 to 25 if you condition the sale of arms with Israel. It's going 0 to 60. You'd be fundamentally changing the relationship.
Ian, do you think the Biden administration is willing to go 0 to 60?
I think that's an overstatement. But I do think that what we heard today, the readout from Biden's conversation with Netanyahu, is a change. Before, what we had was a red line that if the Israeli war cabinet, if the prime minister decided to order an invasion, a ground invasion of Rafah, where 1.5 million Palestinians are sheltering, without finding a way to get them out and humanitarian aid in, that was a red line, and the United States would take action against Israel, action well beyond allowing a Security Council resolution to pass, which the U.S. did last week. Today, we heard something different. Today, we actually heard if Israel does not proactively change their policy of damage to civilians, the willingness to do more, significantly more, to protect Palestinian civilians with the ongoing bombing campaign, and significantly more to get humanitarian aid in, then the United States policy is going to change. And that will include a slowdown or a suspension of some military systems. That's a big deal. It is a dangerous thing for Biden to do because Netanyahu can become a much more significant direct adversary and use his connections in the Republican Party, maybe Trump himself, and certainly some Democrats too, against Biden. But that was the policy that was stated in the readout today. That is new.
Yeah. So what's more likely, Ian, when lawmakers return next week? Conditions tied to Israeli funding or Ukraine funding is at last passed by this Congress?
I think Ukraine funding is almost finished at this point. Meaning it's going to happen. Yeah. $60 billion. It's very clear that Speaker Johnson is trying to wrap this up in a way that is acceptable to his sort of Republican base. And yeah, he's taking a little bit of a risk with his speakership, but he is prepared to do that. Biden feels comfortable on this. Republicans and senators and Democrats in the Senate feel comfortable about this. And the Europeans, who were panicking a few weeks ago, they feel like this is going to go through. So, I mean, look, the Ukrainians are on borrowed time right now. They are pushing to get a new number of Ukrainians sent to the front lines, mobilized. That is passing now. They're going to take the age from 27 to 25, which is necessary and overdue, frankly. But they're also going to get more support from the United States. I feel pretty strongly about that.
Ian, it's good to have you back. Don't be a stranger. Ian Bremmer, thank you for the time today on Bloomberg. As we now add the voice of Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan. Congressman, it's good to have you back. I hope that the recess has been going well as we continue this conversation about potential Ukraine funding. You're about to return to the Capitol to tackle this matter. Ian Bremmer seems to think that you're almost there. We're hearing from the Wall Street investment community and the geopolitical community. Are they right that the House will get this done?
Yeah, I'm maybe not quite as optimistic. I first should say, though, I appreciate Ian going on in a hoodie and a sport coat. That let me take my tie off.
I wish I could pull
that
off.
A little more casual, too. But, while I appreciate his optimism, and I do know that Speaker Johnson is interested in getting this done, he really does. And I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee and I'm on the Europe subcommittee. A lot of us want to get this done. The question is how is it going to get done? I'm maybe not quite as optimistic about the speed of this, but at the end of the day, none of it's done until all of it's done and finished, and we have that passed. So I'm hopeful that we can get something put together. It does. There's a lot of talk internally, at least yet, of some sort of loan program for some of it. I know that's been shot down by Senator McConnell and some others. But at the end of the day, I think the question is something and much closer to what they would like, better than nothing at all. And I hope it's not nothing at all. It just needs to be packaged properly.
Well, there also is the question, Congressman, of what could happen as a result to Speaker Mike Johnson, knowing that your colleague Marjorie Taylor Greene has filed but not acted yet on a motion to vacate. Are you aware of any single member of your conference who would join her in the effort to vacate the Speaker if he puts this on the floor?
I'm not specifically aware of a name, but can I imagine the scenario where people will join her? Yes. Will it be a significant number? I don't think so. Look, we've been to this circus before, and it lasted 3 weeks. This is not something that internally we want to go through. I don't believe it is something that the American people want us to go through either. And quite honestly, I've had Democrat colleagues of mine come up to me and say, hey, just so you're aware, we may not be there to specifically vote for or against Mike Johnson's speakership, but we may not be there. And that's almost a different way of getting to the same result. And so I don't know. This is a huge mistake. I understand Marjorie's frustrated. Hell, I'm frustrated with a lot. But that doesn't mean I'm going around and utilizing every nuclear option that's available, because at the end of the day, we have to get some of these things done, and that takes leadership. And Mike was in this is Speaker Johnson, was in a very difficult position that he was plunked into the middle of. And I think he's doing the best that he possibly can as we now must move into the 2025 appropriation season. We have to get that underway and taken care of so we don't end up back where we're at right now.
That is an unvarnished view of what's happening inside the House of Representatives for our viewers and listeners. Congressman, I'm curious about what the key is then potentially to passing Ukraine aid. We heard earlier today from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in Brussels. Here's what he said.
Earlier today, I chaired a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council. Minister Kuleba updated allies on Ukraine's short and long-term needs and on the progress of its reforms. The situation on the battlefield remains serious. Ukraine needs more air defenses, more ammunition, and more aid.
Congressman Huizenga, is the key to passing this potentially the Repo Act, which I know is being discussed as part of this, using hundreds of billions potentially in Russian assets that have been frozen to help fund the Ukraine effort? Does that make conservative Republicans more likely to vote yes?
I think it helps. That is something that both our Financial Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I serve on both, have been looking at. I think that the authority is there to be able to do that. And in my opinion, it needs to be part of any of the package moving forward. I will also say it was tremendously helpful back a few weeks ago when the EU passed their 50 billion euro, about 53 billion dollars worth of aid. And whether it's real or not, the perception is by many voters out there is that the U.S. is carrying all the freight on this, and that Europe isn't pulling its weight and doing its share. Now, the numbers say something different than that, but that, again, that's a perception. And frankly, this administration has done very little to help its argument and help Ukraine and Europe's argument that the U.S. should be in there and the strategic importance of that help. So I wish the White House would pick up its game and do a better job at explaining why and how this is going to be used. But at the end of the day, a lot of us understand there's help that needs to get there because if we don't do this, in my opinion, in fact, I just literally an hour ago was talking with somebody who's an immigrant from Estonia, and his mother is still there. I mean, the Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, the Finns, all of that whole region understands the power of a unchecked Russia, and they are very eager and anxious to see us help put Russia in a box when it comes to Ukraine.
Well, Congressman, it's great to get your perspective on this, given your seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but you also sit on the Financial Services Committee. In fact, you'd like to be the next chair of it. And I am well aware that that committee next week will be holding a hearing looking specifically at the SEC's climate disclosure rules. And Congressman, we learned today the SEC is pausing implementation of those rules because of the multitude of legal challenges they already have faced. The SEC says they will continue to vigorously defend those rules in court. But what does this change for you and your colleagues in the pushback to this rule? Does this have any implications for the Congressional Review Act, for example?
No, we're going to keep moving ahead with that. That's what the hearing is going to be about. Our Congressional Review Act, the CRA, is attempting to put back the SEC back in a box after they have clearly overstepped their bounds, both not only their traditional bounds, but I would argue their legal bounds. And frankly, all the number of court cases that they have lost indicate that most in the court system believe that they have done this. And it's interesting seeing them move ahead and ignore the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, when they made significant changes, pulling Scope 3 out, which, by the way, there's still a lot of debate as to whether it would really, truly pull Scope 3 out for those publicly traded companies. But now in their message saying that they are pausing implementation of it, they cite the APA. Well, okay, many of us were arguing that they needed to do this on the front end. There was such significant changes made to this rule that they needed to go back and repropose it anyway. So, look, they're losing both coming and going, and so far, Chair Gensler has been able to not been able to rack up very many wins when it comes to this, and I think this is going to be another one of those big goose eggs. Why? Not because we shouldn't be protecting the environment, but because it needs to be done properly, and we have to look at materiality. We have to look at how this is going to affect other parts of the society and the economy, but also, frankly, what is the legal boundaries of the SEC? And it is not what they have been trying to do.
All right, Congressman and Financial Services Member Bill Huizenga of Michigan, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. Now, coming up, President Biden facing increased pressure to change his position on Israel amid its war with Hamas. He talked on the phone about that with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier today, and we'll get the take from our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Biden and the American administration, we have leverage. It is not a theoretical. It's not just asking pretty please or asking for a favor. The United States supports Israel not only politically and theoretically, but concretely. The question is going to become, when is President Biden going to move from saying what he thinks needs to happen to taking the steps that he can take to make it so?
That was Hadar Suskind, Americans for Peace Now president and CEO, former IDF member as well. Joining us now is our political panel, Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden, and Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies. Both of you ladies, great of you to join us. Megan, just because you've worked in messaging for this White House in particular, when President Biden says things like, we will change our policy depending on what we see from you, essentially, to paraphrase his words, is that just rhetoric, or do you think this is a president who's not just trying to message, but is really considering seriously policy change?
Oh, he's absolutely considering policy change. And the president means all he says and says all he means. He says that quite frequently on the trail, and he says it and he, and when he's out in public. But the president would not say something that he does not firmly believe and that he firmly means.
This is an instance, though, of a private conversation today with Benjamin Netanyahu. A fairly sternly worded readout from the White House. But in terms of getting in front of progressive voters to say, hey, we're actually making changes here, what does Joe Biden need to say? He's got people's attention now. Everyone knows that conversation took place today. How does he use it?
I think, look, he's doing what he can, right? He's saying these things. He's saying that there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. He's saying that they need to make changes and to have aid come in, and that they're taking note of what their next steps are. He's doing what he needs to do. And I think that where people are still going to be protesting and people are still going to take note, I think, actions speak louder than words. And this is one of those circumstances where the next actions are going to really matter or really make sense of what he means in this statement. He also says, though, that he supports Israel in their defense of Iran and terrorism. So I think, that he's saying that both of these things can be true, and he's looking for action from Israel and to take care of the people of Gaza and their humanitarian crisis.
Well, we may already be starting to see action from Israel. A statement was just published from the end of Israel's Security Cabinet meeting in which they approved opening the Erez crossing, which is another area into Gaza, in order to get humanitarian aid through. Maybe this is the kind of thing the administration is looking for.
Well, those would be the actions
we'll
that
see.
Megan's talking about.
Right. And we did hear from John Kirby, the NSC spokesman, today that he expected actions within days and weeks. Or hours or days, I think is what he said, pretty near term. But Maura, just to bring you in here, if the administration doesn't see enough from Israel and we start to have a more serious conversation about potential conditions on aid, are Republicans going to go for that, or would this just run into more domestic political difficulty?
The aid question will continue to, I think, hit some roadblocks when it comes to Congress and their ability to get funding to the president's desk. But I think on the larger conversation about the importance of supporting our allies, there are still hostages. People seem to have forgotten that part. Hamas provoked by assaulting thousands of Israelis, innocent Israelis. And I think that that's really what's gotten lost here in this conversation, and that needs to be remembered. What I think President Biden actually is doing well is not going to do a knee-jerk reaction and just answer the call of the loudest voices. I think you have to be very thoughtful. And from a messaging standpoint, as you pointed out, standing by what you've said and following through on that is super important.
Well, while we talk about, actions versus words, Megan, how can the president continue to criticize Israel with a straight face while we continue to ship 2,000-pound bombs that are being dropped on Gaza?
I think he's making it clear that this is, if you guys are going to continue to target aid workers and to further have a crisis with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that this is all going to be conditioned. And I'm not an expert in how we appropriate our help to Israel, so I'm not exactly sure what can be done and what's already been appropriated here. But I do think that from this point forward, the president means business, and he is taking note. And to Maura's point, the president also mentioned the hostages in that in his statement today, and said that the prime minister needs to sit down and have the conversation, and everyone needs to come to the table to bring those people home.
Of course, we've seen in the Senate aid for Israel already pass as part of a wider supplemental package that also includes Ukraine. And Maura, I just wonder, as we consider all of these different alliances that the U.S. has ahead of Congress returning next week, how optimistic you are that aid for Ukraine will pass?
I'm hopeful that the reasonable voices will prevail and get through to Speaker Johnson. Again, with the looming, threat to his gavel, it makes it a little more challenging, but this needs to happen. It's been put off for too long. And we, when we talk about being the greatest country in the world, we are only in that position because of the alliances and the friendships we have around the world. And to jeopardize that and to put those at risk is beyond foolish and would really, really do some damage for the country as a whole.
I think you said it, Kayleigh, referring to John Kirby's line today, which resonates. If we don't see changes from their side, there will have to be changes from our side. It's going to take some time to see what those are, if any. We'll have more with our panel coming up. No labels, no candidate. The third-party effort hangs up its hat in the 2024 presidential race. If you were at work all day and didn't hear about this one, we'll have it next with our panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lines in Washington. No Labels is abandoning its effort against President Biden and Donald Trump. The centrist political group, as it billed itself, faced difficulty finding a candidate who could win, or anyone who would even run. As we reassemble our political panel, Megan Hayes and Maura Gillespie with us. Megan, a lot of Democrats spent a lot of time and money trying to stop this from happening. Is that why this happened, or just was it a flawed concept to begin with?
I think it's a flawed concept to begin with. I think that as Democrats learned in 2016 that having a third-party candidate isn't helpful to Democrats, as we ended up with Donald Trump as the president. But I also think they couldn't find a candidate that was willing to run because they know it's a plan that's fraught with a lot of problems.
Yeah, well, we got no's from a lot of people, including Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Sununu. I mean, the list goes on and on, Maura. And yet it's so interesting that they still couldn't find a candidate in a moment where we know the polling shows that the two major party tickets are unpopular. At least these two candidates are incredibly unpopular. So if this wasn't the moment for a real third party run, is there ever going to be one?
It's hard with the way that the political parties are set up. Because there is so much political capital that you would waste or potentially waste by, creating this third-party run and what No Labels was purporting to do. I do think that people are dissatisfied with the two choices. But the biggest problem isn't to find them a third candidate because people don't feel like there's an avenue to win. I mean, look at RFK Jr. Yes, he has a decent amount of support. He's getting, 10% in some pollings. But the biggest thing to point out is that he doesn't have a path to victory. He's barely on any, I think he's on one ballot right now. So that's the problem. The biggest issue is that people aren't going to go out to vote. And that really impacts the down ballot races, because if people have the fatigue about the Biden versus Trump again, that might deter them from even showing up to vote in the first place.
Joe Biden is going to Baltimore tomorrow. This is an important moment for him, remembering the many calls for him to go to East Palestine. He showed up there following that train derailment a year later. Not that the president is going to be, picking up a welding torch and removing this bridge. What will his job be there?
I think he's there to comfort the families who lost folks and to comfort the state. It's, he's close with Governor Moore, and the mayor has done an incredible job. He's there to be supportive. He's already announced that he's, the federal government's fully going to fund this.
Does he make a request for emergency funding while he's at it?
That, that I don't know. We'd have to talk to our domestic policy folks over at the White House. But I do, he's already said that he's fully supportive of funding. He's obviously a huge supporter of infrastructure. He knows how important bridges are to infrastructure, the economy, the port there. It's super important. I think that he's there, but he's there to be supportive and to put the full weight of the federal government behind the state to rebuild, to get the Port of Baltimore back up and moving.
Well, our colleagues here at Bloomberg are reporting this evening that federal officials could actually be releasing the preliminary findings of their investigation into the bridge collapse as soon as the coming days. It could be made public, according to people familiar with the matter. Maura, just quickly, as Megan is talking about Biden's promise for this to be federally funded, could this actually run into any roadblocks in Congress, or do you think this is one thing that everybody will be able to get their heads together on?
It sounds like there is a meeting planned for next week with Maryland, the Maryland congressional delegation. And it seems as though some members are concerned about just writing a blank check for all the assumed costs. Some members, I think Representative Andy Harris has been saying that he just wants to get the debris out of the river and clear the path. And that's step one. I think that this is something that's pretty massive, obviously, and needs to get done. It's a major pathway for ships and cargo and for people who are commuting across that bridge every day. So this is something that needs to be expedited for sure.
All right, Maura Gillespie and Megan Hayes, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And Joe, we didn't get a chance to talk to them about DJT.
Yeah,
we'll have to do that tomorrow.
Not the ticker symbol, the actual DJ.
Yes, and it's the former president at Mar-a-Lago. Apparently, he really likes to control the and the volume.
Another reason to join us tomorrow.
Yeah, make sure you do so. And while you're at it, of course, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for spending time with us, as always, on Balance of Power. Here on Bloomberg TV and Radio, we'll see you back here tomorrow, live from Washington, only on Bloomberg.